In the forgotten town of Black Hollow, there stands a house frozen in time, a place where dust clings to secrets and the walls remember everything. The Whitlock boarding house, abandoned since the 1970s, is more than a decaying relic. They say if you listen closely, the walls whisper, but what happens when they whisper your name? Join Alex, an urban explorer who thought he was chasing a ghost story, until the story caught him. Welcome to the old Whitlock boarding house. Some places will never let you leave. The sun was sinking behind a thicket of gnarled trees as Alex parked his car at the end of a gravel path. The air was cold, unnaturally so, with a stillness that pressed against his skin. The house loomed ahead, a crumbling relic of forgotten times, its windows like blind eyes staring into nothingness. The shadows of twisted branches tangled themselves in the peeling facade, and the entire structure seemed to lean slightly forward, as if waiting for him. He took a deep breath, the metallic tang of decaying leaves sharp in his nose. He adjusted the camera strapped to his chest, the red light blinking reassuringly. His followers loved this kind of thing, the thrill, the fear, the possibility of encountering something inexplicable. But even as he approached the house, something cold coiled around his spine, a whisper of dread he couldn't quite shake. The porch groaned beneath his boots. As he reached for the doorknob, it swung open by itself with a reluctant, drawn-out creak. He paused. The air inside was stale, heavy with mildew and neglect. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of his flashlight. He stepped inside. Just another old house, he told himself, but the silence disagreed. The floorboards sighed beneath him as he explored. Each step echoed louder than it should have. Alex whispered his usual commentary to the camera, his voice low and steady, trying to project confidence. This is the old Whitlock boarding house, built in 1892. Abandoned sometime in the 1970s. The locals say no one stays here because of the whispers. He paused for effect. A chill rolled down his spine. They say the walls talk to you, but we'll see about that. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, stained yellow and brown. The patterns of ivy and flowers twisted into shapes that seemed to watch him. His flashlight flickered slightly, and the battery indicator dropped to half. He frowned. He'd fully charged it before leaving. As he moved into the hallway, he heard it, a faint murmur, like wind through dry grass. Don't listen. Alex froze, his breath fogging in the cold air. He swept the flashlight down the hall, the beam cutting across doorways that yawned open like mouths. The sound faded. He forced a chuckle. Probably just the wind, he muttered, though the windows were all closed. He climbed the stairs, each step groaning beneath him, threatening to give way. The whispers returned, louder this time, slipping through the cracks in the walls, coiling around him. Don't hear! Leave! The words sent a tremor through his bones. He clenched his jaw and pressed on. The second floor was worse. The hallway was narrow. The walls bowed inward like they were breathing, trying to squeeze him out. The wallpaper peeled in long, sagging strips, exposing dark wood beneath. His flashlight sputtered again. He reached out, steadying himself against the wall. The surface was strangely warm, pulsing faintly beneath his palm, like a heartbeat. He yanked his hand away, his fingers damp with something that smelled like copper. Keep it together, he whispered, more to himself than his viewers. A door at the end of the hall stood ajar. A faint rhythmic sound drifted out, a soft, wet sound, like lips parting or cloth tearing. He pushed the door open with trembling fingers. The room was empty, save for the peeling wallpaper and the scent of something spoiled. The whispers surged. Don't remember, remember, remember. He turned toward the wall. The wallpaper fluttered like skin in a cold breeze. The patterns seemed to shift, the ivy twisting into shapes that looked like faces. One strip of wallpaper hung loosely, and curiosity, or something darker, compelled him to reach out. The paper came away easily, peeling like dead skin. What lay beneath made his breath freeze in his lungs. It wasn't wood, it wasn't plaster. It was flesh, pale, stitched together with crude black threads. Veins pulsed beneath the surface. A half-formed face was trapped within. A nose, a mouth, and worst of all, an eye that flicked open and rolled toward him. He staggered back, bile burning his throat. The whispers grew frantic. "Don't you remember, Alex? You were here before." The voice was his own, hollow and wet, coming from inside the wall. The wall twitched. A ripple passed through it, like something waking up. Faces pressed against the wallpaper from within, distorted, screaming faces, dozens of them, eyes wide in terror. They clawed at the thin membrane, separating them from him. Then the eye in the wall blinked, and he remembered. The memories crashed over him like icy water. He had been here before, years ago. A foolish dare, a night spent in the house when he was just a boy. The whispers had called to him then, too. He had peeled back the wallpaper, seen the truth, and screamed until his mind split apart. He had never left. The house had kept him, his fear, his essence trapped within the walls. The realization hit him like a fist to the gut. He looked down at his hands. They were pale, translucent, like old paper. The camera fell through his fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow clatter. His screams joined the chorus in the walls, a never-ending symphony of those who had come before. The house sighed, the walls exhaled, and the door creaked shut behind him. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faintest echo of his final words. "Don't listen, don't hear, leave." Mark adjusted his grip on the oars. The rhythmic creak of the boat echoing across the lake. The sun was barely a sliver on the horizon, casting streaks of orange and purple across the glassy surface of Blackwater Lake. The air was cold for summer, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Mist curled lazily above the water, winding between the reeds like ghostly fingers. He'd been waiting for this fishing trip all week, a chance to escape work, noise, and the constant buzz of his phone. Just him, the water, and the fish that supposedly grew huge in these parts. His grandfather used to tell him stories of Blackwater Lake, how it held secrets no man should pry into. Mark dismissed those stories, old superstitions, nothing more. He rowed deeper into the lake, the shoreline receding behind him, until the forest became a dark, featureless wall. The mist thickened, swallowing up the world in pale, swirling clouds. He felt like he was drifting into another realm. Mark stopped rowing, letting the boat drift. He baited his hook, his fingers numb, and cast the line into the water with a satisfying plunk. The lake was so still, so unnaturally still, that the ripples seemed reluctant to spread. He leaned back, closing his eyes, enjoying the eerie calm. Then he felt it, a soft tap-tap against the bottom of the boat. Mark's eyes snapped open. He leaned over the side, squinting into the water. It was dark beneath the surface, so dark it seemed bottomless. He shrugged, probably just a branch, but something twisted in his gut, a cold knot of unease. He checked his line. Nothing. He cast again, the lure disappearing into the murky depths. The tap-tap came again, this time harder. The boat shuddered slightly. "Damn fish," Mark muttered, trying to shake off the growing anxiety. He leaned over the side once more, peering into the water. For a moment there was nothing, just blackness. Then, just beneath the surface, he saw it. A face. It was pale, almost translucent, with empty eyes that stared up at him. The mouth was open in a soundless scream, bubbles curling from the lips. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the face was gone, replaced by the shifting darkness of the lake. His heart pounded. He swallowed hard, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a reflection, maybe a submerged log that looked like a face. But the cold sweat on his back told him he knew better. Tap, tap, tap. Harder now. The boat rocked slightly, the water around it trembling. Mark gripped the sides of the boat, his knuckles white. He forced himself to look again. The lake was impossibly dark, but something moved beneath it. He couldn't see what it was, only that it was big, bigger than the boat. A shadow gliding just below the surface, circling. A chill crept up his spine. Then the tug came. A sharp, violent yank on his fishing line. He grabbed the rod instinctively, bracing himself. Whatever was on the other end was strong. The rod bent nearly in half, the line slicing through the water with a high-pitched whine. He dug his feet against the bottom of the boat, pulling back with everything he had. Suddenly, the line went slack. Mark tumbled backward, his head smacking against the side of the boat. Stars burst in his vision. He lay there, disoriented, the world spinning. When he finally sat up, his head pounding, he realized the mist had thickened around him, so dense he could barely see the edge of the boat. The silence was absolute. Then from the mist, he heard it. A whisper, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Mark! His name, spoken from somewhere out on the water. His breath caught in his throat. Mark! It was closer now. The voice was thin, wet, like water trickling through teeth. He fumbled for the oars, panic rising in his chest. He had to get out of here. He rowed blindly, the mist swallowing his frantic movements. Each pull of the oars felt weaker, like the water was turning to sludge. The voice came again, right by his ear. Why did you leave us, Mark?
Mark.
He spun around, but there was nothing, just mist and shadows. A hand shot out of the water, cold, clammy fingers wrapped around his ankle. Mark screamed, kicking desperately, but the grip was like iron. Another hand appeared, then another. Pale arms, dozens of them, reaching up from the water, grasping the sides of the boat, pulling it down. The boat tipped violently, water rushing in. He clawed at the air, trying to stay afloat, but the hands dragged him under. The cold water closed over his head. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the pale, empty-eyed faces of the drowned staring back at him. The next morning, the sun rose over Blackwater Lake, burning away the mist. The surface was calm once again, serene and unbroken. Mark's boat drifted gently, half submerged, one oar floating nearby. There was no sign of Mark. The lake swallowed its secrets, as it always had. And if you listened closely just beneath the surface, you might hear the faintest whisper of a name.
Mark. 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 Help me. Please help me.
Tony's breath crystallized in the frigid air, each exhale fading into the endless white. The sky above Whisper Peak was a dull shade of gray, the clouds pregnant with the threat of more snow. The locals called it a cursed mountain, a place where the winds whispered warnings and the snow concealed ancient secrets. But Tony wasn't one for ghost stories. Adventure is for the bold, he'd always told himself. That's why he was here, alone, scaling this desolate peak despite the warnings. Despite the cautious looks from the village elders who said, no one should climb Whisper Peak alone. He adjusted his pack and tightened his gloves, the leather creaking in the cold. His boots crunched against the icy surface as he pushed forward, the wind clawing at him, a bitter, biting companion. He was so close now. The summit was just a jagged silhouette above him, barely 200 feet away. Almost there, he muttered, his voice lost in the howling wind. But the mountain had other plans. A sharp crack split the air. the sound of ice giving way. Tony's stomach dropped as the ground beneath his feet vanished. He clawed desperately at the crumbling snow, fingers numb and useless. He tumbled, the world a blur of white and grey. His scream was swallowed by the wind, thud, darkness, pain. When he opened his eyes, the world was different. He was sprawled on a bed of icy rock, his body aching. The sky was gone, replaced by the jagged ceiling of a cavern. Shafts of dim light filtered through cracks above, illuminating twisted icicles hanging like the teeth of some monstrous maw. He sat up, wincing. The walls of the cave were smooth, unnaturally so, as if shaped by something more deliberate than time and erosion. Snowflakes drifted down through the cracks, but they made no sound as they landed, as if even nature held its breath here. Tony's heart pounded. He scrambled to his feet and looked up. The hole he'd fallen through was a distant patch of pale grey, the walls too steep and slick to climb. He shouted, his voice raw and desperate, "Help! Somebody, please!" His cry echoed off the walls, warped and twisted, until it blended seamlessly with the wind howling through the cracks. It was as if the cave itself mocked his hope, turning his plea into another part of the mountain's eternal song. He tried to climb. His boots slipped against the ice. His gloved fingers clawed at the rock, finding no purchase. He slid back down, his body slamming into the cave floor. The pain was sharp, but the cold dulled it quickly, creeping into his bones. Time lost meaning. The cold was no longer an enemy, but a companion, wrapping around him like a shroud. His eyes grew heavy, his breath shallow. He sank to his knees, his body folding in on itself. The last thing he saw was the hole above, that distant patch of grey where the sky waited, indifferent. Snowflakes drifted lazily through it, uncaring. His breath slipped from his lips in a faint mist, mingling with the wind. The silence wrapped tighter, the cave holding him in an icy embrace. Then, a sound. A distant echo, a low rumble, barely noticeable beneath the howling wind. A tremor passed through the cave floor, like the mountain itself was exhaling. The hole above blurred, the light dimming further. Or was it his vision failing? His mind teetered on the edge of awareness. Another breath, sharp and ragged. His fingers twitched. Outside, the wind screamed and the snow whispered its cold indifference. Did he move? Was his breath still there, hidden in the freezing air? Or was he now part of the mountain's eternal silence? In the end, the mountain held its secrets close, offering no answers. Because in the cold stillness of Whisper Peak, survival was just a roll of the dice. Thank you for watching The Silent Descent. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Noctivox Lore for more stories that linger in the cold corners of your mind. If you enjoyed unraveling the shadows with us today, don't forget to subscribe to Noctivox Lore and hit the like button to show your support. Share these stories of dread and mystery with those brave enough to listen. Follow us on TikTok for even more chilling tales and behind-the-scenes whispers. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the unknown. Until next time, stay curious and remember, the night is never truly silent.